My name's David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director at the MA in Art Business at Sotheby's Institute of Art, London. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Natasha Degen. And now Natasha is welcome, Natasha.
Thank you so much for having me.
Natasha is a leading scholar of the art market, currently Chair of Art Market Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. Natasha's the author of The Market, a landmark study of contemporary art's relationship with finance, and Merchants of Style, which examines the intersection of art and fashion. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, Frieze, and the Financial Times, amongst others. In January 2026, Natasha will become director of Sotheby's Institute of Art, New York, bringing her academic rigour and global perspective to one of the world's foremost centres for art business education. In this episode, we'll discuss her intellectual journey, her vision for the Institute, and her insights into the evolving art market, from luxury branding and digital platforms to the future of art education. So, Natasha, for listeners who may not know your work, how would you describe your academic and professional journey in the art world?
Yes, well, first and foremost, I'm academic and a professor whose work has centered on the art market, so both the history of the art market as well as its contemporary landscape. And alongside that, I've written a fair amount of journalism and cultural criticism that also kind of probe similar questions, looking at the intersection of culture and commerce. And in terms of my journey, I mean, there's been a lot of chapters. I did my undergraduate education in the US, then I worked in China. I did my graduate work in the UK, which is how we initially got connected, including some teaching at Sotheby's Institute in London. And then I moved back to the US, and I've been back in New York for about 13 years now.
Excellent. Well, it's really nice to see you again. And you've written extensively on the intersection of culture and commerce, Natasha. How do you see your role evolving as you step into leadership at Sotheby's Institute of Art?
Yes, well, I mean, it will be certainly a change, although I see it very much as a continuation of the work that I've been doing, of course. Sotheby's Institute, as you mentioned in the intro, being one of the foremost places to study the relationship between culture and commerce. And so, I'm very excited to continue examining a lot of the same questions, but perhaps in different formats as opposed to what I'm currently been doing. I'll be doing less teaching in my new role, but I'm really excited to be leading courses and programs, events, conferences that will take on a lot of those same questions.
You're going to be very busy, but it's, as you know, it's very exciting being in these worlds.
Yes.
So just maybe rewinding, maybe you could say something about what first drew you to study the art market, because
Mm,
we both know that, I was brought up on classical archaeology and then art history, and we tend to be brought up on art history, and the art market is something very, very different. So maybe you could say something about what drew you to study the art market, and maybe how your time at Princeton and Cambridge shaped your
yeah.
approach.
Yes. Well, I mean, as you said, it wasn't a very obvious thing to study. And that has been one of the biggest changes, I'd say, over the course of my career, which is when I first started expressing an academic interest in the art market, people were a little bit bewildered and thought it was a bit odd or maybe even a bit crass to focus on the market side of things. But of course, now I think it's quite a robust sort of sub-discipline even within art history, but also connecting with so many other academic disciplines as well, economics, sociology, and so on. But yeah, I think even as an undergraduate at Princeton, I was very fortunate that when I was there, I felt so much of my coursework was actually very, very interdisciplinary. And I was always really intrigued by the social context, political context, economic context for art. And a lot of my coursework, even in art history, drew on comparative literature, architecture, or film. So I always found that really dynamic and enriching, that kind of interdisciplinary perspective. But at that point, I wasn't really honing in on the art market. I actually have to say that it was after my undergraduate years when I was working as a journalist in China, and this was around 2006, 2007, when the art market in China was really exploding, and suddenly people even in other, international centers were really fascinated by what was happening in China, and I started doing some reporting on that, on, Poly Auction House, for instance, the largest auction house in China had just been founded, and, people were really interested in all of the new private museums that were being built and opened, and that made me really fascinated specifically in the market, because the market was such a major part of that story of China's kind of emergence onto the world stage. And, I think for me still, the relationship between the market and the way art gets valued more broadly from a kind of cultural or even historic standpoint, how the relationship between the market and canonization or the art historical discourse, I find that really fascinating.
Absolutely. Actually, funny enough, I just before this podcast, I'm just working on a research seminar where we're asked by the unit leader to share our own research methods with the
Mm.
students for once. So I decided to share with them this work I did quite a long time ago, actually, on Franz Hals. And what I was interested in was the pressure on both the market and, in this case, the Met New York, to actually label these things as signatures by Franz Hals, not as potential
Mm.
replicas or studio of. So that's quite interesting again in terms of these kind of market pressures on, but that are very, very linked to kind of cultural production, as it were, and consumption, in the museum and in the art market. So I was, and of course, I guess your role at Sotheby's Institute in New York as a director is very different from mine. I mean, I'm on one MA, which is art business, whereas you're going to be
Mm.
directing a portfolio of MAs on much more art historical subjects, but also luxury and fashion, I believe. Maybe we
Yes.
could come back to that later.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, right now, the master's degree programs in New York are either focused on art and it's art and its markets, but starting in the fall 2026, we'll be launching an MA in luxury business. So that will kind of expand our portfolio.
Absolutely. We have one in London, of course, which has proved really,
Yes.
really exciting. I don't know whether you're aware of this, Natasha.
Mm.
Maybe the listeners who don't know this would be interested. We share our building now with Vogue Education, and there was Condé Nast, and so there's a real feeling in the institute now of luxury, fashion, and art, working together, which is I think where we are at in the zeitgeist at the moment.
Yeah, in parallel to what's happening in the market for sure.
Anyway, so you've held the chair of art market studies at FIT, as I've already said. What have been some standout moments or challenges in that role?
I mean, I've been there now for over 9 years, so there's so many memories that come to mind, and of course, the standouts are, our triumphant moments, either our students or our faculty, but, in terms of challenges, when I was first brought in, I was brought in to really kind of reconceive the MA program, and the duration of the program changed, the coursework and the curriculum changed a lot, and that was really challenging. We also went from being a 4-semester program to a 3-semester program, so it involved some tough calls, and as you know, when the number of courses are finite, there are difficult decisions to be made about what you include and what you don't include, what really deserves having priority in the curriculum, and that was both very, very exciting. There were things that I felt, had been missing in the curriculum despite it being longer. We were kind of condensing the program into 3 semesters, and yet there really wasn't coursework, for instance, on the auction business, because the program at FIT had actually developed in the 1980s in New York at a moment when the gallery business was exploding and was very much focused on galleries. But also, it was very much my point of view, and this is something that I hope to take with me to Sotheby's Institute as well, is that, you really want to prepare students to forge a career in the field. And most of our students, of course, do want to work in the commercial art world, but you also really want it to be based in academic rigor and have, history and theory and that kind of more academic perspective at the same time. And so balancing all those things, I would say was a real challenge. And I learned a lot from that experience. Although, of course, yeah, there's curriculum, as you know, is ever evolving. And as the world and the industry and the discourse evolves, so too does the curriculum.
And we've seen some amazing changes this century. I think you and I both agree that this was the
Mm.
time to be into this subject. It's been quite remarkable, I think, that journey. And we're kind of in a very interesting stage now, which feels slightly like slack water and what's going to happen next, particularly in the contemporary art world, I think.
Mm, mm.
But now we've got these dialogues going very strongly with luxury and fashion. So just been to the
Yeah.
Marie Antoinette exhibition which
Mm.
is called Marie Antoinette Style. So it's one of these kind of typical current exhibitions which looks at the reception, not just at Marie Antoinette's fashion, but the reception in later fashion
Mm.
world. So if you're over in London, I think it
I'll have
carries
to
on
check
till
that
after
out. Yeah,
Christmas.
no, it
Exactly. No,
sounds fascinating.
it's very well curated as well. So
Mm.
coming thinking about your book, so the market, your the book on the market, and then Merchants of Style, they explore very different facets of the art world or the world of culture, if you like. What inspired each, and how do they speak to current trends, as we've just been speaking about? How do those books kind of do that?
Yeah, well, the market was really inspired by the idea of how the market kind of connects to contemporary artistic practice. So, how are artists shaped by the market, or how are they critiquing or attempting to subvert the market in their art, or even using the market as their medium? So, that book was very much, I mean, it's a compilation of texts. So, it's an anthology of texts, and many of the texts are by artists. So, that book, I think, has a very different perspective than Merchants of Style, which it is about the intersection between art and fashion, but and even though artists and designers feature prominently in the book, I think the book at its core is really more about the relationship between the art world and the fashion industry, between these two different fields. And why is it that they're converging or finding more and more kind of they're finding it more and more mutually beneficial to sort of collaborate and join up together. So, I think the orientation of the books are quite different, and the Merchants of Style too, even though it is, the body of the book is very contemporary, it also does have a bit of a historic vantage. The subtitle of the book is called Art and Fashion After Warhol, and it sort of takes Warhol as the sort of starting point in a way. And so, a lot of the book, even in the chapters that are focused on the contemporary moment, go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s to try and trace sort of how we ended up where we are now.
We were at Frieze Masters the other day with the students, and I was walking past one gallery. Can't quite remember what it was. It was a New York gallery, and their kind of key works on the external wall to draw you in. I asked the students, "So, do you know who this artist is?" Because it wasn't obvious. There weren't any obvious signatures, and they were Warhol's very early fashion drawings of
Oh, wow,
shoes.
yeah.
And they were
Did your
amazing.
students were your
Yeah.
students able to
No,
recognize them, or
none of them got it. I thought maybe one of them, but I get that's quite interesting though, because it's again
Mm.
showing how even in the 60s that we've got people like Andy Warhol that we now very much associate with art, art production and already working in fashion, in his early days.
It's fascinating, and I think that's a chapter of Warhol's career. I mean, it's definitely been getting more attention, and I know there have been shows that have been curated of his fashion illustrations, and the big retrospective that we had here in New York at the Whitney Museum included those drawings. But, I think it's still something I come back to as well, because he actually was extremely successful as a commercial illustrator, one of the most successful in the 50s at a moment when, commercial illustration was done by hand, and
Yes.
he had a very distinctive style. I went to the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh last year, and they have a section on his sort of early years. As they have artworks he made as a student or as a child, but also this period in New York when he was a commercial illustrator. And he was, I think the wall text said something like he made the equivalent. I mean, obviously, these were like $1950, not current dollars, but the equivalent of like $300,000 a year. He was already very financially successful as a commercial illustrator. And, I think that it makes his sort of the way that he then really tries to pursue a career in fine art, really very, very interesting, because he gave up this very successful career for something that was far less certain, but also something where I think that the art world had a sort of bias against him as somebody who had come up through this commercial path. And so that also, I think, is very interesting. It sort of informs, I think, his feeling of rejection by the fine art world, and his sort of ambivalent kind of relationship to it.
Yeah, and that model has very much influenced, for example, some of the YBAs. I'm thinking most
Mm,
obviously Damien Hirst, I guess, who famously interviewers often said, well, I don't even know whether what I make is art, but people like it and I produce it in my
mm.
factories. And, it's,
But Damien Hirst arguably went the other way. I mean, he became very successful as a conceptual artist and as, a kind of art world artist, and now has branched out into so many different things over his career, restaurants, fashion, all sorts of kind of commercial products. So, yeah.
yeah, no, it's all there. So turning more to the art market today, how would you describe the biggest shifts in the art market, say, over the past decade?
Mm, yeah.
I
I
guess
mean,
since those years when we saw the art market booming so well with the introduction of Chinese artists internationally, then we get 2008, the Damien Hirst sale at Sotheby's,
mhm,
marking the
mhm.
watershed moment, and then we enter this kind of difficult years, if you like. I mean, how
Yeah,
would you
yeah.
view that?
I mean, you have over the last 10 years. So I guess, I mean, you have the financial crisis and then the aftermath of that. China kind of enters in a really profound way in 2011. According to some metrics, I know Claire McAndrew claimed that, China in 2011 surpassed the US to become the largest art market in the world. And times have really dramatically changed since then. Yeah, I mean, the last 10 years, I can't help but see the pandemic as being the really pivotal kind of moment. I think the pandemic, one, exacerbated trends that were already happening. So, especially the turn towards digital art. I mean, clearly before the pandemic, people were buying works of art from JPEGs. And, there were lots of online auctions and sales. And, obviously digital art was being produced. But I think that the pandemic has really profoundly pushed things in that direction. Also, I think it was really disruptive to this kind of global circuit, this idea that you go from one art fair to the next to a biennial, and it's kind of this never, this kind of global carousel that is going from one city to the next, from one continent to the next. I think that the pandemic really forced people to stop, and some people realized that actually it was maybe a healthier, more sustainable thing not to be traveling quite as much. I think also it made people aware of these sustainability issues with art fairs and constant travel and shipping of artworks. But it also made those things much more expensive. So, I mean, one thing I hear a lot about from people I know here in New York is just how expensive things, the kind of basic fixed costs of running an art business have become because of the increasing costs of things like shipping and insurance. So I think it's been in some ways, I think, yes, the art world has sort of bounced back and has resumed all of its global events and travel and so on, but in a slightly different way, I think. I think it's, that sense. I mean, I remember this so vividly. There was this moment, I'd say after 2000, certainly after the financial crisis, you know, m s maybe until I'd say, maybe between, like, the kind of aftermath of the financial crisis when the art market had sort of rebounded by 2010, 2011 through 2018, 2019, something like that. This period where it seemed inevitable that the art market was veering towards complete globalization. And, you had major galleries that were participating in upwards of a dozen art fairs a year and sending staff all around the world to new markets, even markets that were relatively untested or unestablished, just to sort of see if, maybe we can connect with people there. And maybe this is this kind of seeds of a new arena for the business. And I think, there was just an incredible amount of belief in this sort of global model at that time. And yeah, I don't know. I do think that the pandemic kind of called that into question, and we're still sort of finding our way into perhaps a new phase.
Yeah, and I think there's been some hiccups in globalization, Brexit being another one, which
Yes.
coincided very much with the pandemic. We were with the program, by the way, we were actually at Mars Street for
Hmm.
TFAF when it closed down. notoriously,
Oh, wow.
because it was
Wow.
spreading around there. So we were there with our students, and most people hadn't gone into the fair to see it. So because we had it closed that afternoon, and we were meeting the
Mhm.
students in the afternoon, and we had to just bus them back as quickly as possible back home. We didn't see them again until the degree ceremony, 18
Wow.
months later
Wow.
or whatever. It's quite,
Yeah,
it
no,
was
I
quite,
very distinctly remember that too because the COVID lockdown was right in the aftermath of the Armory show in New York, and
yes, of
people sort of
course.
cited that as a super spreader event where,
Yes.
this was the very beginnings of the pandemic. Yeah, wow.
Um,
Um,
so, so you've written about the convergence. We've already spoken about, or you've spoken about the convergence of art and fashion, and in both your experience and in your particularly your second book or the Merchants of Style book. How do you see that relationship evolving going forward?
hmm. Yeah, I mean, actually, if I can just connect this back to the last question you asked about the what has changed in the last decade,
Yeah.
and I do believe that the pandemic was this really key moment, and I think also the relationship between art and luxury, because I mean, I think particularly you saw with the auction houses in early 2020, there was a sense that the market was in a kind of free fall and people thought it was going to be 2008 all over again. Of course, that didn't end up happening. The pandemic for many art businesses was actually a very good moment because many people were sitting at home looking at their blank walls, bidding on things online or purchasing artwork digitally. But yeah, I think that the way that the market since the pandemic has compensated for the sales of fine art declining has been to kind of encourage more and more of the business to shift towards luxury. And we've seen that more recently in the most recent art market downturn that the business has become to rely more and more on luxury sales with some auction houses, Sotheby's being one, about a third of their turnover now is accounted for by luxury sales. So, I mean, since I wrote the book, I actually feel like this relationship is even deepening further. And I think when I was writing the book, Chanel, for instance, was sort of starting up their kind of fine art sort of team. And I think that's become much bigger and they've been doing things much more publicly. I know, Hermes has been doing more. There's a lot of things if I were to go back and, reissue the book or something, there's a lot of new things that could potentially be brought in, new examples, although I think all of these examples do sort of support some of the same observations, which is that there is this very deeply intertwined relationship now between the worlds of art and the worlds of fashion.
No, absolutely. And it's another thing that's been so exciting in the new millennium. I remember the new Louis Vuitton store in Bond Street opening
Mm,
towards the end of the first decade, and suddenly there's Murakami, there's Richard Prince
mm,
everywhere, and and that was, and then students, of course, started writing dissertations on that. So it's
yeah.
definitely something that's happened. Like so many things have changed in the new millennium, and that's a major one, I think. And as you say, going forward, we look forward to a revised edition of your book, I guess.
Well, I think also the strategies are ever shifting. I mean, the overall thrust is maybe the same, but I remember that too, that moment when there seemed to be the store itself became a kind of Kunsthalle space.
Yeah,
And then, you have the foundation, the Fondation Louis Vuitton opening in
yeah.
Paris as a kind of major cultural player, a major art institution in an already very important city in terms of cultural institutions. So yeah, the strategies keep evolving, but I do see this relationship, for better or worse, as deepening and becoming even more, kind of the two becoming even more enmeshed.
No, definitely. What's your take on the rise of digital platforms, NFTs, maybe the role of social media in shaping taste and value? That's another thing we've seen over the last decade in particular. Where do you think that's
Yeah.
going?
I mean, I'm reminded of I did this roundtable discussion for the German art magazine Text zur Kunst, which is going to be coming out in their December issue. And one of the participants in that is Dirk Boll of Christie's. I think his title is Deputy Chairman 21st Century Art at Christie's. And he said this, and I think this is very, very true, which is, we were talking about in this conversation the what has been called the dealer critic system. So the dealer critic system was an idea that came from a book from the 1960s called Canvases and Careers, where the authors of that book, Harrison and Cynthia White, argue that, one of the major changes with the rise of the Impressionists and then the kind of, the avant garde was this idea that now artists would come up through the support of dealers and critics in kind of combination with each other, as opposed to the state-sponsored salon system of the 19th century. And we were sort of talking about that, talking about whether the dealer-critic system exists anymore, and if not, what has possibly replaced it. And he said something that I think is really true, which is that, maybe at some point, if you wanted to be a successful artist, you needed to have certain critics writing about your work. You needed to be represented by certain dealers. There was sort of a very linear path to success, a kind of clear sort of way that you would advance and you would attract the kind of right sort of attention that would lead to both critical and then market success. And now, there are just so many different ways to find success as an artist. And of course, it depends on how you define success. If you're talking about institutional sort of recognition or you're talking about financial success. But, now there are clearly artists who are quite successful, and have only really, advanced their career through social media and have connected with collectors through social media and show their work through social media. And they don't necessarily need to have in real life exhibitions or have certain critics writing about their work. That's not necessary. There are certain artists who have become very successful through the kind of world of NFTs, which operate, completely separate from the traditional art world. And so I think that's really interesting and provocative that, we live in an era where actually there's a lot of different avenues towards recognition and success, but they're all kind of fractured and a little bit fragmented. And I think that also speaks to sort of the culture that the internet has created where, you have these communities that can exist actually quite separately, even if ultimately it's all about art or visual culture. But that to me is maybe, the kind of NFT boom and bust. I think what that demonstrated was there was this possibility of really sidelining the traditional art world and yet, getting the same kinds of, circulation and financial rewards.
No, absolutely. So now thinking about, you know, you've been a leader and you're going to continue to be a leader, and obviously we'd like to know a little bit about your vision, maybe. So perhaps what excites you most about returning returning to Sotheby's Institute in a leadership role, in a big leadership role in New York, you know?
Yeah, no, I'm very, very excited. I mean, I have a lot of fondness for the Institute. I taught in London and in New York many years ago. And, I think that it's such a special place and that it has this real kind of singular focus. I mean, of course, now there's many different master's degree programs that have their own specializations, but, having spent this most recent part of my career embedded within a much larger institution with a lot of different competing priorities. I'm very, very excited about being in, tight community of people with faculty and students who share the same interests as I do. And I think that's incredibly exciting. And there's just so much potential, I think, to strengthen the institute in so many different ways. So I'm incredibly excited about that. And, I'd say that I'm very excited about strengthening the academic side of things, but also really leveraging the connection with the auction house in maybe new ways. Sotheby has just relocated its headquarters to the Breuer Building in New York, and I got a chance to visit last week. I think that's incredibly exciting. So there's a lot to do, but also I think already a very vibrant culture to be a part of. So, whether it's New York or London, it's an incredible network.
Absolutely. And maybe I could ask, what kind of student experience or perhaps institutional culture are you hoping to foster? I mean, with
Oh.
we have, our students there's still people who were affected, I would say, quite negatively by the lockdowns and pandemic.
Mm,
It's
mm.
quite a challenge, I think, now. And I was just wondering whether what kind of a leader would you like to be in terms of the way the students might see you, think of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, I do see the institute as it's very specialized and it's a very, it's one where there's a lot of shared interests and shared passions between students and faculty. And so that's something that I think is really conducive to a very kind of vibrant, tight-knit community. And that's something I'm very much interested in fostering. But, I also think that the Institute, in terms of the student experience, and this is something that, of course, wasn't really possible during lockdown, but I mean, there is this extraordinary possibility, I think, for students both in New York and London. They're in these art market centers where there's just an incredible wealth of resources all around them. And yet the Institute can provide, a rigorous academic experience in the classroom where students are learning about the history and theory. They're learning from guest speakers and they're getting the most kind of up to date, real world sort of information about what's going on in institutions, in business. They can, maybe attend an event in the evening where they're getting a host of different perspectives. Then they can also go out and be part of immersing themselves in a really dynamic kind of art world, cultural scene. They can be doing a great internship and, you know, finding their professional path. It's an extraordinarily rich opportunity, I think, for students. And I think our job is how to kind of facilitate that the best that we can so that they're getting a lot of different perspectives into a professional world, one that, different perspectives that combine the academic perspective, this perspective that they're not just going to get on the job, but at the same time, they're getting the kind of hands-on experience that will, facilitate that entry into the professional world.
No, absolutely. It's and yeah, I mean, it's so rich. I think sometimes students get a little bit like us. They wish they were more than one person because there's so many possibilities, clashing, gallery events and so on. Um,
Yes.
I was going to ask you. You have been involved with us and in New York in art business education. Can you see? I mean, I've been involved with that a long time now, and
Mm.
I'm trying to get my younger colleagues to kind of, they've been brilliant at producing new ideas and so on. But generally speaking, I think the program has remained almost like an MBA, but with a focus on art business. But I just wondered whether can you see art business developing, maybe especially in terms of its interdisciplinarity that we've spoken about, an ethical engagement going forward?
Hmm. I'd love to turn the question back on you, David. What do you think about the kind of ethical engagement part of this?
I mean, we've always taught, as you might remember, we've always taught a lot of ethics and law.
Mm,
Unfortunately, the ethics aspect, we were talking about although we developed a very exciting electives where students can do courses, run by other MAs, and we also have a shared curriculum where all the students and staff
mm,
worked together at the start of the course called Art Futures. It did mean that we had to lose our law and ethics unit, which ran through the
mm,
whole year. And so we created an elective more that deals more with ethics, if you like. So, I mean, I would like to, and I'm speaking to a new colleague, Lauren Bursey, who's just joined us, who's a practicing art lawyer. We still have a lot of art law and we have an exam on art law, but I'd like to see the ethics sort of coming back into that, if you like, a little bit more than it does, because I think we used to have these wonderful seminars where you're in favour of the Parthenon marbles returning, you're in favour of them staying, discuss, and people would say, oh, I
yeah.
want to go on the other side of the room, and I'd say, no, you've got to learn to see the other point of view. That
Mm.
that's a simple way of putting it, but I think those kind of ethical discussions, it would be nice to reintroduce more of that, I think.
Oh,
um
yeah, absolutely. I mean, those questions I think are really provocative and I think can lead to really fruitful discussions. And of course, the art trade, historically has, I mean, at the very least, has been quite opaque, but sometimes at certain moments in history has been besmirched with a kind of bad reputation for bad dealings. And, I do think that there, because of it's a field that's relatively unregulated. There's latitude to behave in ways that might be legal, but potentially unethical. And so I think having those conversations is really important. I mean, I could see it within different contexts, right? Within an art law class, within a class that's
Yeah.
explicitly on the art trade and ethics. But as you said, I mean, even now this pertains to cultural institutions, museums. I mean, they're all grappling with these kinds of questions, whether it's the British Museum or really almost any institution that has historical artifacts at this point, whether they should be repatriated, how that should be handled. I think these types of questions are actually really fundamental to the business writ large right now, not just the commercial side, but also the non-commercial side.
And and other ethical issues such as diversity, sustainability, that
Mhm.
we're working hard on being a more diverse institute, but it's slow progress, but that's definitely the direction of travel, I think. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
So
and I think the other piece that you mentioned, kind of interdisciplinarity, I think is also so
yes.
fundamental because, I mean, of course, I have maybe a bias here. So much of my work in recent years has been about the intersection of art with other fields, but I do think, the art world, it's becoming very clear is just not going to be as hermetic as it had been. It's seemingly becoming more porous, to fields like fashion, but also I think to design. We've seen the rise of like collectible design. We've seen the rise of digital art and that bringing in a completely different audience for works of art. And so I think that this is something that, is very, very important for students as well to have a kind of broad perspective and to have a kind of, openness and a nimbleness in terms of potentially taking a more expansive approach in their own work and careers.
Yeah, maybe, what about new programs such as luxury business or cultural leadership is another thing I think that we're teaching. How could they respond to market needs? But maybe as we've been talking about ethics, do you think ethical studies is important for, say, cultural leadership and luxury business?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think across the board, these kinds of questions, this is something that graduate education is about, is asking these difficult questions that you don't necessarily have the time or the inclination to ask in your professional work. But this is the kind of foundation that I hope that the Institute does provide to really ask challenging, probing questions and to think critically about these fields, in a number of different directions in terms of their historical development, their future evolution. We obviously teach students about how things operate now, but also should they operate this way? Is that ethical? Is that efficient? I mean, all of these questions I think are really worthy of scrutiny. And, I think that is sort of fundamental to graduate education is to take a kind of questioning approach. But yeah, I mean, I do think that in terms of luxury business, absolutely. I think this is responding to a market trend, but it also goes kind of beyond just a trend, I think, which is that, in my view, I do think that these fields are becoming very, very deeply connected, although arguably they've always been deeply connected in some sense, art and luxury. How do you even separate those two out in a way? And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And, I may even think about organizing an event or a conference around this very question, kind of about, sort of what is the kind of relationship between the markets for art and luxury. And, I think there are certain important historical figures, for instance, that really were operating right at the nexus of art and luxury. And then there's also the way that art and luxury are at certain moments perceived as quite separate and at certain moments perceived as one and the same. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think in some ways the development of art history as an
Mm.
academic discipline is kind of slightly to blame because, for that split, because, I was in Versailles in the summer. I've just been talking about that Marie
Mm.
Antoinette and studying that culture a lot now. And I've just written a chapter for a book on 18th century collecting culture. And it's
Mm.
very, there's no real differentiation between what we now call fine art and luxury goods. And in the ancient world as well, there was no real distinction between what the Romans were looting was basically luxury, of which art and sculpture and painting was just one part of that.
Mm. I mean, and I think the 18th century, you see like a French art dealer like Gersaint, right, and was selling jewelry and exotic sort of like seashells alongside works of fine art, and they were all, part of the same category at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, and the Marchand Mercier, for example, they would give added financial value to, say, a Chinese porcelain that could be quite plain by adding the gilded framing to it, sort of
Mm.
the vaso monte, as you call them, and they suddenly look like luxury objects. There are quite a few in the Marie Antoinette exhibition, like her perfume
Mm.
burners that were originally like porphyry Chinese objects, and they've been put in an 18th century sort of gilded frame, which kind of makes them
Mm.
obvious luxury goods. So talking about, I'm aware of the time now, Natasha, but maybe just thinking about field work and maybe the future of field work for our students, because we already mentioned the fact that, is it ethical to fly our students around the world on, to visit art fairs and so on? But so how might you argue that students do gain from the experience, say, of the Venice Biennale if they're an art business student, or TFAF art fair? Do you think it's
Yeah, I mean, I think the ethical questions are real ones, but it's also undeniable that the benefits are so real for students to go to these different places. I mean, I've been involved between New York and London and trips to all around Europe, to Maastricht, to Artissima in Torino, to Brussels, to the Venice Biennale. We took students when I was in New York to Sao Paulo, to Innoteam, which was unbelievable, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I mean, we've gone extraordinary places, and I think for students, they're always just completely eye-opening to see both the cultural difference and the cultural continuity, to really learn about a place in a way that you really can't just from reading about it, to talk to people firsthand, to be part of this kind of, global community. I think it's incredibly enriching and something that Sotheby's Institute frankly does, really well, probably unparalleled in terms of the kind of access that students get, being able to see private collections and institutions, art fairs, and so on. So I think it's really a hallmark of the master's programs at Sotheby's Institute. But, it also does raise, I think, some very interesting questions at the moment too, because I mean, we were talking about this earlier. Post-pandemic, I think that the idea of just this kind of nonstop 24/7 global circuit has been questioned a bit, but at the same time, I think even just recently, I see a lot of excitement about what's happening, for instance, in the Gulf, in Doha and Abu Dhabi, with Frieze starting a fair in Abu Dhabi and Art Basel in Doha, but also Sotheby's holding a sale in Abu Dhabi. Obviously, in addition to all of the major cultural institutions that have opened there, but also India. I think there's a lot of interest in India right now because that market seems to be growing very, very quickly, and you also have the development of really interesting cultural infrastructure that, is going to be opening imminently, so that's very, very exciting. So, yeah, we'll see. I think we're entering a new chapter perhaps in terms of this kind of push and pull between the local and the global, which always seems to be the case in the art market.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, well, maybe I could still ask you, how do you see, it's a big question, obviously, how do you see regional markets becoming more influential in the future and shaping global trends? I guess we're talking about discovering artists from underrepresented nations as well as markets developing.
Mm, hmm. Yes, and I think that kind of question is yeah, it's a very interesting one and a complicated one because on one hand, I do think we went through this period of new markets becoming really major global players. So for instance, China, I mentioned earlier, but according to some, became the largest art market in the world at one point. And now China has contracted a lot. It's now, I think, according to the UBS our Basel report number 3. I mean, the US has kind of consolidated its position. So now, according to, again, the same report, about 43% market share. So that's huge. And yeah, so it's kind of constantly in flux. I mean, for those of us in New York, I guess that's a good thing. It makes it a very exciting place to study and to be. But, I also think that to me, it seems like maybe a kind of interregnum that we're still in this sort of holdover from the pandemic. I think politically, too, there's, between Brexit, a lot of things have been in flux. There was a lot of talk after Brexit, right, that Paris would sort of take over as the European capital of art. And I don't know that that's completely happened, although Paris has become also very dynamic and interesting as a art world center. But, I do think that there also is so much amazing work being produced all around the world. And the way that certain centers get attention, institutional market attention, but also, attention for the art that's being produced. Those are two kind of separate questions. Obviously, to have art market infrastructure requires a certain amount of financial activity and a certain amount of kind of patronage. But the question of art production, I mean, now you see artists in every corner of the world. You see biennials, art institutions springing up in every corner of the world, and that is something that I don't see sort of slowing down or abating. So that question of how much we pay attention to different regions, to different parts of the world, I think is always evolving.
We saw it at the last edition of the Biennale d'Arte, the art
Mm,
biennial. With the Global South, the emphasis on that,
mhm,
and
mhm.
there were many. I remember saying to the students, what's the big African art fair? And they said 154. I said, what's that mean? Well, it's one nation, 54. Well, one continent, 54 nations. I said, okay, how many nations are there in South America? In Latin America, we tend to, do the same to that
Yeah.
area as well, and not think of different nations. Yeah. So anyway, maybe some closing reflections, Natasha. Maybe what advice would you give to students or early career professionals entering the art world today? If you think back to where
Um,
you were.
I think that for those who are starting their careers, I would always suggest to try and really, as you get experiences, professional experience, as you begin to navigate this world, really try and be honest with yourself about what excites you. What parts or aspects of the experiences that you have had, do you really enjoy most? And I think that that can be helpful in kind of figuring out your path. Because I also think the art world, there's what I constantly hear from students of in our program, is just that they came into the program maybe knowing only of one or two potential jobs or career paths. But in the art world, I mean, it's ever growing, and there's you could work for a gallery, you could work for an auction house, you could be a studio manager for an artist, you could work in art insurance, you could work in art logistics. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And if you really enjoy working with artists, there is a career path for you. But also, if you really don't enjoy working with artists, there is a career path for you. If you like collaborating, if you like working on your own, I think that there are ways to really play into your strengths and to find a way to spend, to maximize the time that you spend doing the things that you really enjoy most and that you find really interesting. And that is the amazing thing I think about this world is it's actually quite capacious. There's a lot of different possibilities within this field. There are jobs that are very corporate. There are jobs that are quite the opposite of that. And that's something I think about. I also think, like, for early career professionals, something that I've thought about a lot when I've, thought about a new opportunity is also where you think you can add value. And if something really excites you and interests you, but you also feel like you have value to provide, I think that that's generally a good sign that, maybe it's an opportunity worth taking and pursuing.
That's it. That's a really valuable answer, I think, for my current students and alumni to hear. You're quite right. There's so many opportunities in that world, and there are jobs there that no one has ever imagined. You often don't see these kinds of jobs listed
Mm.
anywhere. They're very often people just move. The number of times a student says to me, "Oh, I was just at this exhibition the other day, and this person was talking to me. Oh, what do you do? I'm doing this course. Oh, come and be interviewed." And it was some a job that they'd never occurred that they might do. So you're quite right. There's such a variety out there.
I think
Um,
especially now, I mean, there's new jobs that are emerging too. I wrote a piece for Art Forum last year about artist agents, and I interviewed a lot of people that are working in that space, kind of, liaising between artists and brands, helping to kind of create these partnerships, broker commissions, and all of those people. I mean, they've forged their own path. They saw a kind of need that wasn't being met, a role that had value within a kind of marketplace, but that didn't exactly exist or wasn't a well-trodden path. And so I think we live in a moment too where being entrepreneurial, being open-minded is really, really beneficial.
and as you know, we have an annual entrepreneurial competition called the Gavel
Mhm.
competition, which the students find very exciting and encouraging them to be entrepreneurial. But I often say to students that some students say, "Do I have to be entrepreneurial?" I said, "No, you have a right to not
Exactly.
be."
That's exactly right. That's
Yeah,
exactly right, and that's not the career path for everyone, nor should it be, but I do think that there's this kind of wide range of possibilities that are available, if that is something that you find exciting, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to pursue it.
absolutely. And so one final reflection, Natasha, is there a book exhibition or artist you're particularly excited about right now?
Well, I will admit that I I'm going to give an answer that is something I'm in the midst of reading right now. So I haven't completed it yet, but I'm reading a book by a former colleague of mine. Her name is Mary Davis, and it's called Paul Perret, Inventing Modern Luxury. It's a book that is out in the UK and I think is about to come out in the US. But it's about Paul Perret, who I write about in the introduction of Merchants of Style, a fashion designer at the turn of the century in Paris. Incredibly important historical figure, kind of freed women from the corset, so they say, and really had an extremely interesting relationship with avant-garde art in that period. In fact, worked with a lot of artists on his all of the kind of materials and ephemera for his atelier, the stationery, his business cards, textile designs. And yet, when I was researching Merchants of Style, I was really surprised that there wasn't more written about him because he really was, you could argue, and I think Mary Davis does argue in this new book that he really invented the luxury brand in the kind of modern conception. So I'm really excited about the book. It's very well researched, it's very engaging. And so, I encourage your audience to check it out as well if they're interested in this intersection between art and luxury or just the birth of the luxury brand.
It's already on my Christmas list, Natasha.
Oh, good to hear.
Anyway, Natasha, thank you for sharing your time and insights with us today. I think that all the listeners will agree it's been really fascinating to hear about your journey and your vision for Sotheby's Institute in New York and your reflections on the art market's future. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.